My son Yusuf is almost 5 years old. He's cheeky, charming, almost always smiling, and on the surface, incredibly confident. But when he was 2.5, maybe 3 years old, I think it was the development of a belief. And he told it to me as I was buckling him into his car seat one day. He said, "Papa, I don't want to be a Muslim anymore." And those 8 little words broke my heart. Because as a person of color, as a religious and ethnic minority, as an immigrant, and as a psychologist, I know just how critical a strong identity is to happiness and good psychological health. But more importantly, how important it is to being a confident, productive member of society. But I played it safe. I got in the car, started to drive, and then I said to him, "So, Yusuf, how come you don't want to be a Muslim anymore?" And he said this to me as clear as day. He said, "Because Paw Patrol only celebrates Christmas." And he was right. As a young Canadian, he didn't see himself reflected in the world around him. In the institutions that held power and sway on the development of socialization and identity, he and others like him are just not represented. But Yusuf's thinking wasn't just influenced by a single cartoon. Yusuf's thinking was influenced because the lack of representation is systemic. And that begins early in childhood from things that seem as simple and innocent as toys, as cartoons. And that begins with things like Lego, where you'll notice the leader of a set of Asian characters is a white boy, all the way to superheroes, where you'll notice the only person of color here is the Hulk. And even he was white before he got angry. Now, there is progress because we have the Black Panther, who Yusuf thinks is Muslim, and I've just not bothered to correct that yet. But even this perpetuates the Orientalist belief that a black man can only be a king, can only be a hero in Africa. The lack of representation continues on in our adult world as well, too. In fashion, in Hollywood, even our CEOs and our prime ministers are predominantly white men. The white standard is a real phenomenon, ethnically and culturally. Because as my son so clearly pointed out, even the holidays that we choose to celebrate as a society do not reflect the diversity of our Western society. We focus on Christian-centric Easter and Christmas. No Rosh Hashanah, no Diwali, no Chinese New Year, no Eid or Ramadan, not even National Aboriginal Day is a statutory holiday. There is the focus instead on one tradition in a country with many traditions. Marian Wright Edelman, she said, "You can't be what you can't see." She was a child's right advocate. But representation is critical to all ages because representation changes the way that we think, and not just of the minority, but also the majority. Representation is also critical to influence 2 components of successful communication and human interaction: the way we see ourselves and the way that we see others. Now, there are some people who might say we live in a predominantly white and Eurocentric world, so then our practices and culture should be white and Eurocentric. But the most recent census informs us that almost 1 in 3 Canadians is a visible minority or an Indigenous person. Another 1 in 3 do not belong to a Christian heritage or practice. Western society is diverse in numbers, and so our culture and practice should be too. So at this point in time, we might be feeling quite uncomfortable hearing a lot of these heavy truths. And I would say it's probably because we're unhappy with the way things are. I would argue that most Canadians don't see themselves as racist. Most of us value multiculturalism. even the institutions and the organizations that we belong to, well, they claim to support these values of multiculturalism. So then why do they not? I would say it's because we're complacent in the way that we think about and the way that we practice diversity and inclusion. We feel we've come far enough on resolving issues of discrimination simply because we have more diverse people in our society and because we drink from the same water fountain. But that is not sufficient if we want to live in a truly inclusive world. When we're complacent in the way that we think about diversity and inclusion, this happens. A recent poll found that 67% of Canadians feel that we should be screening immigrants based on their values for safety. Now that suggests that the core values of people around the world are different, and they're not. But it also suggests that a different way of thinking is dangerous. Xenophobic beliefs like this exist because we misunderstand those that we perceive to be different from us, because their stories aren't told or represented well. Now, all of this is not just dangerous for the human psyche, it's costly to our economy. A lack of representation negatively impacts learning. A lack of representation reduces productivity tenfold. A lack of representation decreases communication between groups of people, and all of that undermines the economy of our nation. So it makes sense then that we try to understand and resolve the thoughts that are responsible for not just ethnic, cultural, and religious discrimination, but for discrimination against women, against the LGBTQ community, against people with disabilities, mental or physical. The beliefs that are responsible for these kinds of difficulties are what we call unconscious bias. They remain outside of our realm of awareness, but they clearly impact the way that we interact with each other and the way that we feel about each other. The good news is that if we can be more mindful about how we think about other people, our beliefs, those biases, then we can make more conscious efforts at changing how we might interact with people. And that changes how we feel about different people. Now, there's one key bias that explains why Paw Patrol only celebrates Christmas and why our CEOs and prime ministers, predominantly white men, and that's the us versus them bias. Us is local, white, and that's familiar, so it's comfortable and good. Them is colored, cultural, and foreign. And that's not so comfortable, so it's not good. How do I know that people see me as foreign? Because of the one question I get asked on a pretty regular basis. Where are you from? Now, this question is ripe with implications, but I answer it anyhow. I answer, Winnipeg. But it's a follow-up question that shows how stuck we can be in our bias. Oh, but where are you really from? Why? Because Winnipeg is not believable? Because the assumption is that I'm not local? And so people of color remain perpetually foreign. No amount of time lived here, no citizenship, no taxes paid, no contribution to science or society deems us more local than those who appear white. Now, all this might come across as me being overly sensitive, so please let's clarify that. I want you to think about inclusion like it's inviting a vegetarian family member over for dinner. We say we love them, we value their choices and their beliefs, and then we only serve meat at the table. Heaps and heaps of bacon, sausage, and short ribs. And then they can't eat and are a little bit perturbed, and then we think, jeez, how sensitive of them. And entitled, they came over to our house. Well, some people might be thinking, enough with the complaining. Can we just look forward? Truth and reconciliation, are we living in the past? Oh, but complaining. or at least the ability to be heard, is a part of the solution. I mean, I get it. This is really heavy, awkward, and guilt-provoking information. It makes us all incredibly anxious. But as a psychologist, I've treated anxiety as a specialist for the past 13 years. So let me tell you a little secret about anxiety, okay? The more you avoid, the worse it gets. See, avoidance promotes this false belief that we're safe when we avoid that thing that makes us anxious, when in truth, it only makes us more anxious and increasingly sensitive. Working through the anxiety means wading through the waters of discomfort. And then ultimately, our body adjusts to that cold and uncomfortable temperature, and then we can finally start to swim. So, wade into the waters of discomfort and stay there for a little while. Move towards the problem instead of away from it. Generally, avoid avoidance. Now, in doing this, we begin to feel much more comfortable in talking about these issues of diversity and inclusion, and then something really amazing happens. We start to identify our bias for just that, bias. And bias is a human thing. We all have it. It doesn't necessarily make us bad people, but it can reflect the lack of information due to a lack of information. Bias, or talking about discrimination, can also do one pretty amazing thing. It creates space for those who've been discriminated against, for those who've been marginalized. It helps them feel normalized and validated. And all of this helps us to think more practically and problem solve. Let me give you an example. So I was on my way to DC for work. I get onto a flight, I have a seat, and I'm so looking forward to this Star Trek movie. So I open it up, and then this woman comes on the plane, and she's on her cell phone talking very loudly, complaining about her employees. And I'll admit it, I had a bias against this woman. And as luck would have it, she came and sat right next to me. All I wanted to do was finish watching Star Trek, but all I could think about was, I bet you she's going to ask me where I'm from. Well, a few minutes later, she finishes her phone call, hangs up, looks curiously over at me, and then taps me on the shoulder. I pull out my earbuds, I brace for impact, and then she says, "Excuse me, what race are you?" "Excuse me," I said. "Well, I mean, where are you from?" "Winnipeg." "No, but where are you really from?" "And where are you really from?" I said, irritated. Now, I was annoyed, and not just because Star Trek was interrupted. Now, later on in the flight, after we could feel the awkwardness and the tension pulsating between us, she had the bravery to tap me on my shoulder again. But this time she said, "I'm really sorry. I realized I offended you, but I don't understand why what I asked was so offensive. And I'm asking because I don't want to do it to somebody else, so would you please do me the honor of explaining why?" And then my apprehensiveness instantly dropped, and her anxiety left as a result of that. And her and I had a really amazing discussion. She had owned her error and moved into the anxiety. She transformed her anxiety into curiosity. And that gave me space. She acknowledged my experience. It was enough for me to put down Star Trek and give her the time of day to start talking. And she admitted to me that she wouldn't have asked me where I was from if I was white, because she would have assumed we were similar because we looked the same. And I said to her, asking me where I was from simply because I wasn't white, it removed my sense of connectedness to a place that I call home. Now, the way I look, my background is a part of who I am. It's critically important to me. But it can't be used to assume things about me or thrust into any conversation as a dinner party novelty. My background and identity, just like all of yours, is a part of who I am, not all of who I am. Now, this conversation did something else. It changed my perception of her from negative to fairly positive. We talked, we found out we had a lot more in common. We were more similar than different, despite the fact that we might not have looked the same. I found out she was a leader in her field and her community, that she was well-traveled and well-educated, and her thinking shifted from us versus them to simply us. What if we all do what this woman did? Lean into the anxiety of the discussions of diversity and inclusion, talk more about how bias, whether it's intentional or not, might perpetuate institutionalized racism. Now, I would argue that we don't just need to do this as individuals, but leaders need to do this for the communities, the organizations, and the countries they lead, because, frankly, leaders set a trend. They lead. So let's get back to my son, to his 2.5, almost 3-year-old realization that his face and his culture were not present in a country and a culture that were his. And so this is my challenge to you all. In specific, this is my call to all leaders. Will we stop being complacent? Will we use our privilege and the ability to influence the way other people think, to create a new standard that is not just a white standard for my son and for everybody else like him? So if you're his teacher, if you end up his employer, if you're his mayor, if you're his prime minister, if you're his president, heck, if you're the production company that puts on the shows that he watches, including Paw Patrol, will you stop being complacent? Will you wade into the waters of discomfort and learn about the issues of diversity and inclusion and the problems that come with a lack of representation? Will he and others like him be represented in all aspects of their life? Will he and others have space in a world that is theirs? I hope these questions will help shift our perspectives, but ultimately our practice, because perspective is nothing unless it's acted upon. And questions, well, they can be worthless unless we answer them. Thank you.